McKay here, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. If you've read Ernest Hemingway's novels and short stories, you know that guns often play an important role in his stories. Whether he's writing about safaris in Africa or the fictional world of guerrilla soldiers in the Spanish Civil War, Hemingway often included rich asides about the guns he or his characters used. Hemingway loved firearms, and his love for them infused his writing. But what firearms did this famous hunter and marksman own? What do his guns tell us about Hemingway the man? Well, our guest today has spent the past 3 years researching this very topic. His name is Silvio Calabi, and he's the co-author of the book Hemingway's Guns, The Sporting Arms of Ernest Hemingway. Silvio is first and foremost a sportsman. He organizes and guides hunts all over the world. And he's also been an editor of several sporting magazines for the past 30 years, and he continues to write professionally about hunting from his home in Maine. Well, Silvio, thank you for being on the Art of Manliness podcast. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Brett.
Okay, so, Silvio, tell us a little bit about why you decided to write about Hemingway's guns. It's kind of a really obscure niche topic. I mean, what inspired you to do that?
Yeah, I guess it is obscure, but Hemingway himself is anything but obscure. You know, he's become something of a cottage industry unto himself. I mean, every year, 50 years after his death, books are still written about him, such as this one, for example. But specifically, it came about because I was asked to contribute to an academic book about Ernest Hemingway's safari writings, and I was asked to write a chapter about him on safari. You know, the nuts and bolts of safari, the guns, the game, how safaris are carried out, today and in his time, so that the people who read the book, the academic portions of the book, would have sort of a foundation to go on. And these are things that I know pretty well, so I was happy to do it. And it became so interesting. I mean, what we found out about the man and about his guns and so on, it was so captivating that when this particular project was over, a couple of friends of mine said, we'd love to help you research his other guns, the ones that he used in the American West and in Europe and so on. And we just kept on going, and it turned into a book. And what was interesting about it was that it was it wound up being sort of a new way to see Ernest Hemingway. I mean, this man's been dissected and studied 16 different ways, and yet here was a new angle to the man. As every hunter or shooter knows, one's choice of guns tells us a lot about this person. It's a really personal decision, much like the kind of car one drives or even the person one marries. And somebody who's well-versed in shooting lore and gun making and so on can tell a lot about an individual simply by looking at his or her guns when they arrive in camp. And his guns painted a very interesting picture of Ernest Hemingway.
So what do Hemingway's guns tell us about Hemingway the man?
Well, he had a lifelong fixation, almost an obsession with truth and credibility, with knowing what he called the true gen about things. True gen was a term that was coined by the Royal Air Force in World War II when he was covering the war with the RAF. The true gen was, okay, here's the real situation over Germany, for example, that the RAF gave its bomber command and fighter command before they actually left England. Here's the weather, here's the state of opposition, and so on. It was what you really needed to know. He was driven by this need to be really good at everything he did, and he became an expert in everything he did, or at least in everything he cared about, and it turned out that his choice of guns really bears this out. I mean, he became a wealthy man, and he could have afforded very expensive guns that were, heavily engraved and made with exhibition grade wood and things like that. But he had no interest in that whatsoever. He went straight for the high quality, highly functional guns. They weren't necessarily the most expensive at all, but he simply selected the ones that were really perfect for the task at hand, and then he followed through. He learned how to use them very well.
And so, what were Hemingway's favorite guns throughout his life and his collection that he amassed? Did he have any particular favorites that he enjoyed the most?
It's not fair to call him a collector, because a collector usually buys the aesthetic flourishes, the engraving and so on. But he amassed a number of guns, and they were all, as I say, these very useful guns. He had three that I would say were favorites, and two of them stayed with him his entire life. One was a Winchester Model 12 pump-action shotgun in 12 gauge that, judging by its serial number, he bought in the late teens. And this stayed with him, as I say, throughout his entire life. He figured that he put something like 250,000 rounds through it, and he wore every bit of finish off it. But he kept it up very well. I mean, if anything, he over-oiled his guns, and somebody, actually one of his sons, told me that at the end of that gun's life, there was so much oil soaked into the head of the stock that when you slammed the bolt back, or the bolt back, you could actually see oil start to come out of the wood. And another was his Springfield rifle. The Springfield was the American military infantry rifle for many years, dating from 1903 till, well, really up until World War II. And these were available to civilians through the NRA, the National Rifle Association. And you could buy a Springfield pretty inexpensively, and then turn it over to a gunsmith and have it sporterized, have it turned into a hunting rifle. And in 1930, Hemingway had Griffin and Howe, the famous gunsmithing firm in New York City, do up a custom Springfield for him. And of course, that was in the .30-06 military caliber. And he carried that rifle from 1930. Well, he had it until his death in 1961, and he hunted hard with it. He used it in Africa on 2 safaris. He used it in the American West. It was never far away. It was really one of his signature pieces. And then there's a third one. He had a real fondness for the little Woodsman 22 automatic pistol that Colts made for many, many years. He had at least 3, possibly 4 of these, dating back from the 19-teens up until the 1950s. And he gave at least 2 of them away to good friends of his as mementos. A 22 pistol is not a serious hunting weapon, as you know, but it's great fun for target practice or for plinking, which is a sort of informal shooting around camp. And on safari in Africa, Hemingway used his little Woodsman pistol for all kinds of things. He even shot scorpions as they crawled out of the firewood pile in camp.
Did any of these guns that Hemingway really enjoyed using, did they end up in any of the stories or books that he wrote? Like, one of the characters used a shotgun that he was fond of, or a pistol.
Yeah, he did that quite a bit, and in fact, that was really the genesis or the foundation of much of our research. We spent a lot of time reading Hemingway's novels and his magazine pieces, and looking for mention of particular guns. And then as soon as I found a mention, then then you'd start to backtrack and see whether you could find any evidence that he himself owned any of these. Quite often that was the case. Hemingway he wrote about things that he knew and he understood and that he had lived. His war novels had to do with the Spanish Civil War, for example, and he covered the Spanish Civil War for 2 years. And in some cases, Over the River and Into the Trees, for example, the Colonel Cantwell, who was the hero of that book, he parallels Hemingway so closely that you could almost simply change the names, and insert Hemingway where you have Richard Cantwell. It was difficult in Hemingway's life and in his writings to know, where the reality stopped and the literary invention took over.
So what happened to these guns? I know in the book you mentioned he did use and own several, dozens of different types of guns. What happened to him after they left his possession? Are there any interesting stories in particular that you found about the owners that came after Hemingway?
We've tracked down maybe half of the guns in the book. Some of them are now in the hands of private collectors. One is about to be sold at auction in 2 weeks, as a matter of fact. I think the most interesting story of all is his, again, that Winchester Model 12 that he had, his pump gun. Ernest Hemingway died in 1961, and 2 years later, his wife, Mary, sent 4 of his guns to New York, to Abercrombie and Fitch, to be on consignment, to be sold. One of them was this really beat up by now ancient Model 12 pump gun. We found in the Griffin and Howe, or Abercrombie and Fitch, it was the same company at that point, in the ledgers, in their sales records, that it had been sold to an individual named John Nodop. Well, through sheer good fortune, we were able to find John Nodop, who is now a retired Air Force chaplain in his late 60s. And in 1963, I think he was a freshman in college, and he would go into New York City to have lunch with his dad, who worked in an office somewhere in Manhattan. And then after lunch, once in a while, they would go into Abercrombie's and take the elevator up to the gun room on the 7th floor, which was kind of a legendary place for people, who hunted and fished and so on. So they're up there one day, and in the racks of expensive guns from England and Spain and Italy and America and Germany, John Nodop told me that he came across this really beat-up old 12-gauge pump gun, and it had a price tag on it that was an order of magnitude lower than anything else at Abercrombie's. And he turned to his dad and he said, look, here's a gun at Abercrombie's I can afford. I really want this. Well, he wound up buying it. As he was doing the deal, he asked the salesman at Abercrombie's why there was some rust on the gun, some pitting on the receiver. And the salesman told him that, he said, this belonged to some duck hunter out on Long Island. Used it out in the salt water. Don't worry, that should just buff right out. So John took it home, took it to school, used it for many years. He put a new stock on it. He finally, in the 1980s, wound up trading it in on something else and lost track of it entirely. Well, he never gave it another thought until last Christmas, when I called him out of the blue, and I told him who I was and what we were working on, and he even remembered the serial number of this gun. And until then, he had no idea that the Model 12 that he had paid $35 for had been Ernest Hemingway's favorite shotgun.
Huh. Good.
So that gun is out there probably somewhere. We figure the book may well flush this thing out of the weeds. Somebody's going to read that book and say, oh my God, serial number 525, whatever it is, I think I have that.
You got the Hemingway gun. So how did you research this book? You mentioned a little bit that you'd read the novels and kind of picked up on guns he mentioned. But how, after that, how did you track down, what happened to the guns after they left his possession? I mean, I can imagine this was probably something very extensive and very time intensive.
It did take quite a long time. There were two sources that turned out to be absolutely invaluable. One was the sales ledgers from both Griffin and Howe and Abercrombie and Fitch. Griffin and Howe was the gunsmithing firm, and that was established in around the time of, around World War I. But in 1930, it was acquired by Abercrombie and Fitch, the famous sporting goods retailer in Manhattan. And they kept, of course, careful records of all their firearms sales. And those records exist today. There are, if I remember right, it's something like 60,000 pages, or No, I believe it's 60 books and 12,000 pages of record. They're all in storage in a basement in New Jersey. Abercrombie and Fitch doesn't exist anymore, but Griffin and Howe does. And there's a gentleman at Griffin and Howe named Bob Beach, who is their more or less unofficial historian. And Bob he helped us tremendously by combing these ledgers, these sales records, for any mention of Ernest Hemingway. And then he would provide us with serial numbers. The other way that it worked was if we had a serial number or a make and model and caliber of a gun, we would go to Bob and say, look, have you ever found one of these in your ledgers? And once in a while we get lucky and he'd say, yes, by God, and it was purchased by E. Hemingway on such and such a date. So that was one really important resource. And the other was the Hemingway Archive, which is stored at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston. And I spent quite a bit of time there going through the photo files, looking for photos of Ernest Hemingway carrying one or another gun. I'm probably the only person who ever went through those files looking specifically for guns. Everybody else was looking for family members or whatever. So with the narrative mention, with the sales information from Griffin and Howe, and with the photos that we could find in the archive, that gave us, we were able to sort of triangulate in on certain guns. And then, but there were other sources as well. There are a few friends and family members of Ernest Hemingway who still survive, and they were very helpful to us. And then there was a certain amount of serendipity, and then simply the word began to get out. I mean, this research went on. It started in 2007, and the book was published in November of 2010. So there was time for the ripples to spread far and wide. Certainly don't have we know that he owned more guns than what we detailed in the book, and we're still looking for them. And we certainly don't have the full story on absolutely every gun that's in the book, but we figured that the book itself would, as I think I said earlier, would flush some of these guns out of the weeds, and that's already begun to happen. We've heard of 3 more that we're researching now to establish their provenance.
So we all know that Hemingway was an avid hunter. So what were some of his favorite hunts that he went on during his life?
Well, he grew up hunting in Michigan, hunting and fishing. He was posted to Europe as a newspaper and magazine writer in the 20s, and he traveled around Europe skiing, but also hunting and fishing. And then in the 20s, he began to go to Montana and Wyoming, and he hunted out there, deer and elk and bear and so on. The high points of his hunting career were certainly his 2 African safaris. He went in 1933, late 33 into early 34 in East Africa, which is Kenya and what was then called Tanganyika, now Tanzania. And then 20 years later, he went on a much longer safari, I think it was 5 months, in 53 and 54. An African safari is usually the pinnacle of any hunter's career. He was also, much as he hunted with a rifle and hunted big game, he was first and last, I believe, a wing shooter, a bird hunter. And I think he simply loved hunting pheasant and duck out in Idaho. So when the last few years of his life, he owned a home in just outside Sun Valley, and he had been visiting the area for many years. Was drawn there in part by the terrific bird hunting. So I think it's best we can think of him as an avid, lifelong bird hunter, but a man who really would never forget his African safaris.
So I know this is kind of a morbid question, but I know it's something that Hemingway fans talk about. In fact, my dad and I were having this conversation before I found about your book, and it's something they wonder about is, do we know which gun Hemingway used to end his life?
Actually, I think we do. And it is a bit of a morbid question, but I have to say that most people who, they hear about this book, that's one of the first questions they ask. And it's interesting. The conventional wisdom has it that he killed himself with a Boss shotgun. Boss is a very upper end firm in London that builds a few very expensive shotguns and annually, largely by hand. And we thought this was strange because we could find no evidence that he ever owned a Boss. So we began to dig. Roger Sanger, one of my colleagues, lives in Sun Valley. Purely by chance, well, let me back up and say that the reason that there's a mystery around this gun is because after Hemingway's death, his family turned the gun over to a local welder in Ketchum, in Idaho, with orders to destroy the gun and dispose of the pieces, because the family did not want it to become some kind of a macabre curiosity. Roger lives in Sun Valley, as I say, and he heard that not all the pieces had been disposed of. And it turned out that the welding company that had destroyed the gun in 1961 was still there and still in business and now being operated by the grandson of the man who cut the gun up 50 years ago. And so Roger went to meet him, and the man said, "Oh, would you like to see some pieces of that gun?" And it turned out that his grandfather had kept 5 little scraps of this thing. And when I say little scraps, I mean it. That's exactly what they were. They fit into a matchbox. And Roger was able to borrow the pieces. We photographed them. We looked at them. Steve and Roger, my 2 co-authors, and I all had the same reaction when we saw the pieces, and that was, this is no Boss gun. Well, if it's not a Boss, what is it? So we went through what sort of a CSI-style investigation. That we called on some English gun makers, we called on some gun collectors, some real specialists, and we realized after a while that what we were looking at was pieces of a particular gun made by another English firm, the W.C. Scott and Company. And we already knew that Hemingway, in fact, owned a Scott gun. So by comparing the engraving patterns on the remnant little bits of steel and so on, we think we're quite definite that the gun that he killed himself was, in fact, his W.C. Scott gun. And sort of the last piece of the puzzle was that the Scott gun itself is nowhere to be found. So, it may well have been the one that was cut up and destroyed. So at this point, when I tell the story, someone always says, well, and then the major pieces of the gun were taken out into a field and simply buried. So then someone always says, well, can't you go find that field and go out there with a shovel? Well, it turns out that there's a house that was now sitting in that field, and the house, in fact, belongs to Adam West, who was TV's Batman.
Yeah.
So those pieces are long gone.
Huh. Well, it's very sad story of how he ended his life, but it's very interesting how you guys were able to uncover that kind of mystery. Because it gets floated around all the time. People always, whenever we talk about Hemingway, that's one of the questions that always comes up. And when I told my dad about this book, that was one of the first questions that came to his mind. So
and if you go to Wikipedia, for instance, and it'll mention the Boss gun in the Wikipedia entry on Ernest Hemingway. So again, we don't know where this came from, but we're quite confident that that's not true, and we now have the answer.
Well, you guys need to get on there and update it.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, Silvio, our time is running up. Before we leave, is there any place that our listeners can go to learn more about your work?
I would invite people to go to Amazon and look for Hemingway's guns. For one thing, far and away the least expensive, the lowest price on the gun anywhere, and Amazon's been doing very well with the book. But they also sell a number of my earlier books. They're out of print, but used copies are available. I worked for almost 30 years for outdoor magazines, fishing and hunting magazines, as an editor and a publisher, and I'm sort of semi-retired now, and gone back to my original love, which was writing about these things. But I think Amazon is a good place to start.
Excellent. Well, Silvio, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me, too.
Our guest today was Silvio Calabi. He's the co-author of the book Hemingway's Guns, and you can check out his book and buy it at Amazon.com. Well, that wraps up another edition of the